this place where it all began. Innocent, green fields and peaceful towns of Wisconsin seemed like the last places for brutal crimes. But at the end of April 2018, the tranquil life of the small town of Westport was shattered. It was here that I received a distressing call. On the outskirts of the town, near Forest Road 51, a body was found. A horrifying, disfigured body, completely beaten, lay half-hidden in the tall grass. The head was tilted back, the face almost unrecognizable, and the arms and legs were sprawled in an awkward position, as if the body had been discarded like unwanted trash. When I arrived at the scene, it was even worse than I had expected. Bloodstains covered the grass. Bruises and cuts adorned her entire skin. The girl had suffered before her death. That was obvious. I was immediately overcome with the feeling that someone had not just wanted to kill, but intended to inflict as much pain and suffering as possible. A multitude of questions flooded my mind. Who could have done such a thing? One person or more? Why so viciously and aggressively? There were no answers, just as there were no clues. The next day, the victim was identified, Jessica Riley, a young woman from a neighboring town. I knew Jessica. We lived in the same neighborhood, and although I didn't know her well, in Westport, everyone knows everyone. Her brother, Tom, called me. He told me that his last conversation with Jessica had been strange. She mentioned things that were hard for me to take seriously at the time. But one thing she said to him was very clear. I need help. Then her brother, more in jest than seriously, advised her to run away, to which she replied that she couldn't. Well, this was just the beginning of the nightmare that would soon unfold before our eyes. Jessica Riley, a name that now spread throughout the town. When her body was identified, everyone, from the police to the locals, wondered how such a tragedy could happen in Westport. At first glance, Jessica seemed like an ordinary resident of the town. At 30, she had managed to settle down. She worked as a manager in a small real estate agency, rented an apartment on the outskirts, and lived a fairly independent life. But those who knew her better could say that her life was far from simple. In the past year, Jessica's life had undergone changes. Her relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Zach Nelson, who was almost a decade older than her, had become increasingly complicated. Zach, according to acquaintances, was a charismatic but highly unstable person. For a while, they dated, but soon her friends began to notice strange changes in her behavior. She increasingly complained that Zach was controlling her, demanding attention, and interfering in her life. She discussed these issues with her friend Ellie, who knew that there was tension in Jessica's relationship. When we started questioning Jessica's acquaintances about her relationship with Zach, more troubling details began to emerge. According to Ellie, at first, Jessica found Zach interesting and fun, but over time his behavior began to frighten her. He often staged jealousy scenes and sometimes even open scandals. Ellie also revealed that in the last few months, Jessica seemed to be trying to find a way out of these relationships, but Zach wouldn't let her go, constantly finding ways to be around her. Soon, the police discovered that Zach, Jessica, and another woman named Kristen Adams had been seen in several towns in the state prior to her death. Kristen was a rather strange character. She turned out to be Zach's business partner, and their relationship went beyond professional. Kristen was a few years older than Jessica and had a dominant personality. She often boasted that her father was a high-ranking police officer and repeatedly claimed that connections could get her out of any trouble. According to Ellie, Jessica always treated Kristen with caution and, despite not feeling sympathy for her, could not completely break ties with her because of her connections with Zach. With each passing day, the story became more tangled. We gathered evidence that Jessica, Zach, and Kristen had lived together in a motel near Westport for some time. And now we were interested in one thing. What happened in room number 15, and how did it lead to such a terrible outcome? At first, it looked like a random murder, caused by a quarrel or a sudden outburst of anger. But the deeper we delved into Jessica's life, the clearer it became that her death was the result of a complex and painful story. The motel where they stayed was an old building, almost isolated on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by dense forest. Room number 15 became the place where the tragedy finally unfolded. When the maid found her body, the room was in complete disarray. Blood covered the sheets and furniture, belongings were scattered throughout the room, and there were signs of a struggle on the floor. Investigating the room, we found a faint smell of vinegar. Someone had tried to clean the crime scene, as if trying to hide the evidence. Lieutenant Jones, our lead forensic scientist, conducted tests, and the luminol he used to illuminate the room showed that blood was literally everywhere. Especially a lot of it was in the bathroom, which gave reason to believe that it was there that Jessica suffered the most brutal attack. Witnesses working at the motel claimed to have seen Jessica, Zach, and Kristen together a few hours before her death. They bought alcohol at a local store and then returned to the motel with a huge bottle of whiskey and several flasks of vodka. Later, it turned out that this party, living together, working, and relaxing, was the result of a sort of triangular agreement. Kristen proposed this, as she put it, polygamous arrangement to keep Zach. Friends of Jessica told us that she hesitated but apparently agreed for a while, hoping that it would change their relationship. However, this was a terrible idea from the start. What began as an attempt to find a compromise soon turned into a nightmare for Jessica. It soon became clear that between the three of them, a tangle of jealousy, manipulation, and constant scandals had formed. According to witnesses, she was often seen with bruises that she hid under long sleeves and scarves. Zach and Kristen seemed increasingly tense, and Jessica felt uncomfortable and depressed in this situation. We gathered another important piece of evidence. One of Jessica's friends, Ellie, revealed that they had a plan to escape. The last time she spoke to Jessica on the phone, they agreed that she would take a bus and go back to her hometown to finally break up with Zach and Kristen. Ellie offered to meet her at the station and provide temporary shelter. But Jessica never called that night. When we learned about this plan, we realized that Jessica had a serious motive to escape these relationships. But what happened that she couldn't leave? As it became clear later, Kristen and Zach, perhaps, already knew about her plans and were ready to prevent her departure by any means. It became increasingly obvious that Jessica had found herself in a real trap. Evidence gathered during the investigation began to paint a picture of horror, where her attempts to break ties with Zach and Kristen turned against her. Over the 2 months that she lived with them, her life seemed to have stalled. She was financially dependent on them, and her psychological state had sharply deteriorated. Zach and Kristen seemed to have established complete control over her, not giving her the slightest chance to take a step aside. When we found recordings from surveillance cameras installed on the motel grounds, we saw the trio returning the night before the murder. They were clearly under the influence of alcohol, staggering and laughing loudly as they entered room number 15. However, within a few hours, the merriment turned into a terrible scene of violence. Ellie's testimony, Jessica's friend, became the key to understanding how serious Jessica's fears were of these people. In their last conversation, Jessica told her a phrase that now sounds ominous. "They will kill me if they find out I want to leave." Ellie tried to persuade her to leave immediately, but Jessica was scared and didn't know what to do. It seems her fear was not unfounded. The pressure and manipulation reached a climax that fateful night. Traces found at the crime scene indicated a brutal struggle. Furniture was overturned, and there were bloodstains on the walls and bed. In the bathroom, we found a torn shower curtain with bloody handprints. Tests showed that one of these prints belonged to Zach. Another troubling discovery we made later. On a broken wooden stick found in the room, there was Jessica's blood, and the stick itself was broken into several pieces, indicating its use as a weapon. The interrogation of Kristen and Zach added even more darkness to this already tangled story. Zach refused to give testimony, and Kristen put forward a version of events in which she tried to save Jessica from Zach's outburst of anger. In her story, there were obvious contradictions. At first, she claimed that she left the room when the quarrel began, but then added that she witnessed the attack. Nevertheless, she insisted that she did not actively participate in the violence. But there were those who saw Kristen differently. Witnesses from local bars described her as a dominant and manipulative woman who could lead people into dangerous situations for her own benefit. In her phone messages sent to Zach on the night of the murder, we found more evidence pointing to jealousy and anger. She wrote him messages with threats, accusing him and Jessica of betrayal, and even mentioned that her father could fix any problems. We continued to unravel the tangled web of relationships, and the further the investigation progressed, the stronger our feeling grew that Kristen played a much more active role in this tragedy than she wanted to show. With each new fact uncovered, the picture of the events in room number 15 became increasingly horrifying and tangled. Under the close scrutiny of detectives, Kristen's testimony and behavior began to seem increasingly suspicious. According to her, she accidentally ended up in the room at the moment of the brutal attack on Jessica, but the bloodstains on her clothes told a different story. Moreover, a medical examination showed that Kristen had scratches and bruises on her hands, as if she had also participated in the struggle. Witnesses from local establishments also reported that on the eve of the tragedy, Kristen was irritable and aggressive. She constantly checked her phone, sending and receiving numerous messages from Zach and Jessica. Among the messages we managed to obtain, there were threats against Jessica, written with a clear tinge of jealousy and malice. Phrases like, "You will never take him away from me," and "you will regret coming into my life" spoke for themselves. Uncovering the contents of the suspect's phones, we found another important detail. Correspondence with Jessica's brother, Tom, indicated that Jessica was seriously frightened and repeatedly said that Zach and Kristen are obsessed with the idea of controlling her. She tried to find a way out of this triangle, but apparently, neither Kristen nor Zach intended to let her go. The situation escalated when we learned that in the last days of her life, Jessica was indeed planning to escape. She tried to sell some of her belongings, take some cash, and even began looking for temporary housing. This information was confirmed by her colleagues from the real estate agency where she worked. However, every step she took seemed to be under Kristen's close scrutiny, which at some point offered her to move in with them for her own safety. How ironic. This decision, perhaps, became a fatal mistake. Examining this protective tactic of Kristen's, we began to see a pattern. A woman accustomed to controlling others, using her father's connections to manipulate the situation. This tendency, according to acquaintances, had been with her for a long time. Kristen literally lived in constant fear of losing Zach, and any woman, even a casual acquaintance, posed a threat to her. But Jessica turned out to be not just an acquaintance, but the one who, it seemed, became her competitor in love and business life. With each new piece of evidence, it became obvious that Kristen could have played a decisive role in Jessica's fate. She had motives, opportunities, and perhaps even a plan to eliminate her rival. The deeper we delved into Kristen's past, the clearer her tendency to manipulate and control became. People who knew her from her teenage years described her as someone who always got her way, sometimes resorting to threats and cunning. She not only controlled Zach, but also actively used his dependence on her. He was younger, impressionable, and his life before meeting Kristen was unstable and full of conflicts. They met when he was in a difficult situation, and it seemed that Kristen filled this void with her support, which in reality turned out to be harsh control. It was she who proposed the triangular relationship with Jessica when she realized she was losing power over Zach. And for a while, this scheme worked. Jessica tried to adapt to this strange union, despite her confusion. But as the tension in their triangular relationship grew, Jessica increasingly realized that she had become a hostage to this situation. She felt that she no longer had a say in the relationship or in her own life. According to Ellie, Jessica's friend, everything became even more difficult when Kristen began threatening Jessica with retribution if she tried to break off the relationship. In one of their last conversations, Jessica confessed to Ellie that she was afraid for her life, that Kristen could cross the line. And it was because of this that she went to extreme measures, planning her escape. She intended to leave the city, wanting to start a new life away from this toxic dependence. But it was her decision to leave that became the last straw for Kristen, who saw it as betrayal and treachery. Meanwhile, Zach remained under Kristen's influence, completely unable to resist her manipulations. He did not even hide from those around him that, despite his attachment to Jessica, his relationship with Kristen was stronger. When we interrogated him, he often said that he felt indebted to Kristen, and this debt forced him to fulfill her will. We found evidence that a few hours before the tragedy, Kristen staged a jealousy scene for Zach, accusing him of choosing Jessica over her. She demanded that he make a decision, stating that she would not tolerate competition. The subsequent events were captured on the motel's surveillance cameras. The night before the murder began with a noisy party in room number 15, after which neighbors heard screams and loud thuds coming from the room. No one paid attention to it at the time. For the motel workers, these were just another rowdy guests. But the next day, when the maid's scream shattered the motel's silence, it became clear a tragedy had occurred. All the evidence we gathered, recordings of conversations, fingerprints, witness statements, pointed to the fact that Kristen played a central role in the resolution of this drama. However, despite all the evidence, one unresolved question remained. Was Zach an accomplice, or was he, like Jessica, a victim of Kristen's manipulations? Resolving this question became the most difficult part of the investigation for us. Zach, despite the numerous evidence, seemed confused, pliable, and his own stories were full of contradictions. His behavior reminded us of a psychologically broken person, unable to resist Kristen's onslaught and her influence. His story changed from interrogation to interrogation. At first, he claimed that he did not remember the details of that night, then tried to shift the blame onto Kristen, but in the end, his testimony was too vague and jumbled to be taken at face value. His behavior resembled that of a psychologically broken person, unable to resist Kristen's pressure and her influence. The trial was long and exhausting, and at its center was the very manipulation that Kristen, it seemed, held Zach in her power. Becoming her partner, he became dependent on her approval, and she ruthlessly used this, forcing him to participate in her intrigues. During the trial, the court found out that Kristen had repeatedly threatened Zach, and that her influence could reach the level of psychological pressure, which she used to keep him in these unhealthy relationships. Kristen appeared in court first, and her defense built a line of justification, claiming that she was only defending herself from a sudden outburst of aggression from Jessica. She portrayed herself as a victim, suddenly finding herself in a dangerous situation. But the evidence gathered against her was too convincing. Prosecutors insisted that her jealousy and fear of losing control over Zach were the main reasons for Jessica's death. Witnesses from the motel, acquaintances, and colleagues of the victim confirmed that in the weeks leading up to the incident, Kristen behaved unstably, aggressively, and threatened Jessica. When Zach spoke in court, his words sounded like a bitter confession. He described how Kristen provoked his jealousy, manipulated his feelings, making him afraid to lose her support. But despite this, his participation in concealing evidence and attempting to cover up the traces could not be justified only by her influence. Zach could have stopped, sought help, but instead he continued to follow her orders, which made him an accomplice in all respects. When the jury returned with the verdict, Westport held its breath. Kristen was found guilty of first-degree murder. Her actions, motivated by jealousy, manipulation, and a desire for control, became the central argument of the prosecution. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Zach received a less severe punishment for complicity and concealing evidence, 25 years in prison. This tragedy left a deep mark on our community. For us, this was not just a trial, but also a painful lesson about how the destructive influence of one person can change the lives of others. Jessica Riley became a victim not only of a brutal murder, but also of constant pressure, manipulation, and jealousy from which she could not escape. The judge, delivering the sentence, emphasized that Jessica deserved better, a life free from violence and control. Her tragic fate now became a symbol of the struggle against domestic violence and emotional pressure. The whole story, another reminder that true monsters sometimes hide behind masks of care and love until it is too late.